and welcome to our celebration of the incredible new book, Finding Sanctuary. The internationally renowned wildlife artist Barry Van Dusen is the author, artist, and designer of this amazing tour de force that celebrates the landscapes and wildlife of Mass Audubon's extraordinary wildlife sanctuaries. I'm Amy Montague, the director of the Museum of American Bird Art at Mass Audubon, otherwise known as MABA. Finding Sanctuary is the second book published by MABA, and I'm delighted that so many people can join us this evening to launch this wonderful book into the world. The book is the result of an ambitious project that Barry and I hatched together on a day in late January 2015, as the first flakes began to fall for what became the legendary 9 feet of snow that winter. I had known Barry for more than 2 decades by then, but we'd never planned anything like this Artist in Residence project. He would visit every Mass Audubon wildlife sanctuary from the Berkshires to the islands, drawing, painting, in the field and later in the studio, and also writing a blog about those visits. I knew the resulting body of work would be spectacular, and it was. As his artworks and blog posts were shared with the public, an appreciative audience began to ask whether there would one day be a book. Mass Audubon's then president, Gary Clayton, was an enthusiastic supporter of the idea. Nina and Jean Doggett, along with an anonymous donor, stepped forward with generous donations to make the book possible. And Barry worked tirelessly on every aspect of the production. When you get the chance to hold a copy in your hands, you will see how many people are acknowledged for their help along the way, and we are grateful to each one. Now I want to tell you briefly about the plan for the next hour. First, you will see a pre-recorded interview of Barry by the amazing Julie Zickefoose. Those of you who follow Julie on Facebook or on her blog know that she's a dynamic interpreter of the astonishing things birds think and do. She's the author of 5 books, including Baby Birds and Artist Looks into the Nest. And at MABA, we were very delighted to exhibit the original artwork for that book back in 2016. Her most recent book is Saving Jemima, Life and Love with a Hard Luck Jay. She writes and paints from an 80-acre sanctuary in Appalachian, Ohio. After that interview, Sean Kent, the education director at MABA, will introduce short video greetings from 2 luminaries of the bird art world. The Swedish artist Lars Johnson, who is one of the most celebrated bird artists alive, and David Sibley, whose field guides are both beautiful and deeply informative and are surely on the shelves of nearly everyone in the audience right now. Both Lars and David will have questions for Barry, and that will kick off a live Q&A session with Barry, including questions from the audience. So start thinking now about the questions you'd like to ask. And finally, if you haven't yet acquired your own copy of the book, there will be information at the end of the hour about how to purchase it. And now let's visit with Julie and the star of the evening, Barry Van Dusen.
Barry, we've been friends for a long time.
Yes, we have, Julie. You bet.
I have loved your work forever. And I don't think there was a book I ever anticipated with more glee and delight than this one. I just have been so excited about the fact that you've hauled off and done this thing.
Well, thank you, Julie. I'm sorry it took so long.
That's quite all right. It's well worth waiting for. Having visited your studio in Princeton and care with which you curate your sketchbooks and your drawings and your paintings, I knew that you would have this wealth of art to draw upon. But I was unprepared for the beauty of this book, for the fact that it's absolutely bursting. Every single page has something beautiful on it. And did you feel at any point that you were throwing your entire oeuvre out to the world?
In a way, yes, although it was really a continuation of everything I've been doing all along. I mean, I've been keeping sketchbooks since around 1982. And I've been, and obviously I've been producing watercolor paintings all those years as well. So it didn't feel a lot different, except that the pace of it was picked up a little bit. And one difference is, though, I did do a lot more writing during the production of the book, which is something, of course, you're much better at than I am. It took me a while to get my head into a space for that. But it was good for me to write on a regular basis the way I had to do for the book. People may not understand that after each sanctuary visit, I wrote an account of that visit, which appeared on the museum blog.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So I was careful to, after every visit, I was careful to leave some time open for myself to write for the blog about that visit, and also to catch up on any kind of studio follow-up that I wanted to do after each visit.
Sure.
But did that answer your question? I'm not sure.
It did. It did. You threw a lot of work into this book. I want to back up a little bit and talk about the grand concept of the book. I'd love to know how it came to be. Was it a conversation between you and Amy Montague, the director of the Museum of American Bird Art?
Well, in the back of my mind, I've been a Mass Audubon member for many, many years. And I've probably visited, maybe a third of the wildlife sanctuaries that they have. And in the back of my mind, even years ago, I thought, gee, wouldn't it be nice to go to every single one of the wildlife sanctuaries that Mass Audubon runs? So that was there, but I was doing a workshop at the museum, and I did a slideshow about artist in residences, because I have done several other residencies around New England in the last decade or so. And at the end of that PowerPoint that I did there at the museum, Amy came up to me and said, well, I think it's time for you to do a residency for Mass Audubon. And the idea of a statewide residency was very appealing to me. The other residency I've done here in New England were situations where I would work at the same location, for a number of different visits. Tower Hill Botanic Garden, I think I went over there like 25 or 26 times during the course of a year. The Coastal Maine Botanic Garden, I went up there and stayed there and worked up there for a while. So the other residencies, I was in one place and working in one place. The statewide residency really sounded attractive to me because, well, I'd see some places I hadn't seen before in Massachusetts, and there would be this constant changing of scenery and seasons and birds and flowers and all of that. So it was a very appealing idea. So I jumped at the chance, you bet.
So was there a concept that a book come out of it from the very start?
No, not at the beginning. No. There has been an artist in residence program at the museum, and Amy has had other artist in residences work at the museum or in conjunction with the museum over the last 10 or 15 years. But this was something that we decided would. I forgot, what was your question? I forgot what your question was there.
Did we think it would be a book?
The book. Yes, absolutely. No, the book really came later. Amy and I ironed out a contract between the two of us for the residency, and we decided, we talked about things like how many sanctuaries would I work to visit, and how would I use the blog at the museum. How I would present the images. That we did, of course, plan on a show, an exhibition at the museum at the end of a certain period of time after the first 2 years. She wanted to do the whole thing in a year. She wanted me to visit all this, I think it was 45 sanctuaries that we wanted to visit initially, or that I had set my sights on. And she wanted to do that in a year. And I think there was some pressure from Mass Audubon administration to, get it done and get it moving. Right. Well, that seemed unrealistic to me. I couldn't see working at all those different sanctuaries and producing artwork and drawings and writing about them in a single year. So I asked for 2 years. I asked for a 2-year working period. And we settled on that. And of course, in the end, it took 4.5 years for me to visit all of the sanctuaries. After I'd done 45 sanctuaries, I couldn't stop there.
No, you couldn't stop there. So you finally did a total of what, 60 or 61?
61 was my total count.
Uh-huh.
When I started the project, there were like 56, I think, sanctuaries. But then Mass Audubon's constantly developing new properties and opening new sanctuaries.
Fantastic.
So after that initial working period, and then when Gary, Clayton, and Amy brought up the idea of a book, then I said, well, we've got to bring things up to date. So I decided to do the additional, I think it was additional 5 new sanctuaries that had been created over the, since the end of my working period. So I added those to all the visits I'd done to bring the book right up to date. And 61 was the final number of properties. So
fantastic.
The book was a later, I think after people could see that, that I was following through and producing paintings and continuing to visit sanctuaries. I think that, and the body of work that was being generated, I think they could see that a book project was the logical way to go with the project.
Absolutely, absolutely. Barry, I can't really think of anybody else who would have the diligence and the field skills to bring this off. And as far as I'm concerned, 4 years is almost nothing for what you've accomplished here. It's absolutely stunning. But not only did you do that, but you designed the entire book. You scanned all the paintings.
That's correct.
Yeah, Am I right?
Yeah,
so are you a Swiss Army knife here?
Well, I was trained in graphic design. I went to university for graphic design. So I had, college courses in layout and typography, and advertising and those types of things. I also specialized in illustration, so I was doing a lot of drawing in school as well. Mm-hmm. But I did have a good background in design, and in fact, I have designed several books for the Massachusetts Audubon Society. The Breeding Bird Atlas I designed for them.
Yes.
Birds of Massachusetts, a grassland bird book. So I had done some book design for Mass Audubon.
Right.
So they knew I had those capabilities. But what was nice for me, putting this book together, this is the first book that I've both written and illustrated. And it was really nice for me to have that total control over the look of the book, over the page layouts, the design. I mean, yes, it was a lot of extra work, a lot of extra hours.
But you'd have it no other way because you need to make sure each page is designed to your liking. And I had a little experience like that with my second book, The Bluebird Effect, and then with Baby Birds, where I was so integral to the design of each page, and my notions about where things should go were so specific that I was allowed into the inner sanctum of the design department at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. Thank you.
So the art director didn't want to kick you out after that.
Right. I was
driving him crazy.
Yes, I was trying to be very respectful, but the truth is that sometimes the artist is the only person who really knows where something ought to go or
absolutely, yeah.
So that's a great privilege to be able to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I enjoyed that aspect of it. I hadn't used those skills in a while. It was fun to kind of come up to speed with changes that had happened in publishing and type styles and that type of thing. So it was a pleasure really working on that end of it.
Yes, and the fonts are absolutely gorgeous. Sans serif, gorgeous fonts. Yes, just beautiful. So what I'm working on here is the word book seems to scare so many creatives. They're happy to write poetry, they're happy to paint and sketch and draw, but when you say you need to do a book, people just seize up, back off, stop what they're doing and say, well, I couldn't do a book.
Right.
But so does the word book, did the word book ever scare you, or had you done so much illustration that it was just sure?
I've had my work illustrated and used my paintings and drawings have been used in a number of different books.
Sure.
So I was used to seeing my work in reproduction and seeing what kinds of problems come up in reproduction and that type of thing.
Yeah.
No, the book thing was something that I've always wanted to do a book, and the one thing that made this project probably a good way to ease into doing a book was that all along during the course of those 4 years that I was working on the sanctuary visits, I was writing after every visit. So I was generating the text over the course of years, rather than trying to sit down and put together, 4 years worth of experience from memory or something like that.
Exactly.
So,
That's
that
absolutely key.
And I think that would have been intimidating for me if someone had said, okay, you've got to write about this, this 4 years of experience basically from scratch.
Yes.
It was easier to be able to have that body of written words as a basis for the book. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I would submit that blogging is a powerful way to get into writing a book. Because if you've got the bones in the blog posts, it's no big deal to take it from blog speak to book speak and put it together in that way. And that's one reason I've been blogging since 2005, and it's been
you have. Yeah, you got
like an incubator for my thoughts and my essays and things. And I often go back to it and say, well, that'd work for this column or this article. Yeah. So it's great.
I think the other thing about blogs is it forces you to write on a regular basis.
Right.
Now, I know you don't have a problem with that.
Yeah.
But for me, writing is a little more of a chore for me.
Yes.
And to be, the blog forced me to write on a regular basis. And the thing that I think that helped the most, as far as my writing, I learned how to edit myself. When I first started out writing, I used a lot more words than I needed to, and I'd show it to my wife Lisa, and she'd go, "Oh my God!" She'd start slashing away. And I think this is probably something a lot of writers go through, is learning how to edit yourself and find out, where your voice is in an efficient way.
Yes. Yeah. Well, the text is very spare, very nice, very evocative of your experience. And one thing that I am so intrigued about is this concept of, in Massachusetts weather and Massachusetts traffic and Massachusetts you got out there and went to 61 different places with the expectation that at the end of your day visit, you would come away with a painting or two, or maybe 3, and a blog entry that would then go into a book. And that's just, I don't know, that's daunting. I mean, knowing something about Massachusetts traffic, did you have to plan your visits? Can't go out the Cape on a Friday.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. I mean, I always enjoyed my trips to Western Massachusetts. I mean, it was like, hey, the wide open road, those.
That's why I live in Ohio.
And, I kind of had to, work up my courage to drive to some of these locations. I'm not a city driver. I don't like driving in cities or urban areas.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm not as comfortable in those. I've always been a country boy. So it did. And I had to time some of my visits, like those migrant traps up on the North Shore, Marblehead Neck and Nahant Thicket. You really had to time your driving to and from those locations because the traffic could be horrendous.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in addition to the creative pressure of having to come up with something for each site, you had the logistic and temporal pressures of just being in New England and having to drive a vehicle there to get to them. So I can't salute your effort enough. But let's just talk about some of the paintings in this book.
Sure.
I think one of the ones that just really gets me is the winter barn in the snow. And it's Wachusett Meadow, I think.
That's right nearby. There was when I first started the project, that would have been in March 2015. I don't know what it was like for you out in Ohio, Julie, but in March 2015 in Massachusetts, eastern Massachusetts and central Massachusetts, we had an average of about 3.5 feet of snow on the ground.
Oh my goodness!
And at Wachusett Meadow, the trails were all closed. It was crazy snow that year. We haven't had anything like that since. The following year, of course, I was still working on the residency project. Had almost no snow at all, almost a completely open winter. And it was at the end of that winter, 2016, that I thought, gee, I don't have many snow scenes for the book, for the residency project. I didn't know the book at that point. I said, I really love to have some snow scenes, and I love painting snow. It's a wonderful time of year to paint.
Yes.
So we had this freak spring snowstorm. First day of spring, had a heavy snowfall. About 6 to 8 inches of nice fluffy snow on the ground. And since I live only minutes from Wachusett Meadow, I raced down there, and the snow was still coming down, and I just walked out behind the barn there, and that beautiful typical New England cow barn, the horse barn that they have
Yes.
there. And I did the most of the painting on location. I talk about in the book how I added the snow flurries later in my studio. Yes, yeah.
That's the fun part. Now, do you have a favorite painting in the book?
I think that was one of them, the barn scene. I really,
Yeah.
that, being so close to home and having a lot of associations with the Wachusett Meadow. The kingfisher that I did at Wellfleet Bay was, I think, one of my favorite birds that I did for the book.
Yeah, it's a fabulous painting.
Yeah, kingfishers have such unusual proportions, such unusual bodily proportions.
Yes, they're very fun to draw.
And you have to fight yourself to, you tend to try to average things out when you're drawing.
Right.
I remember a similar experience where I was drawing American bison at a bison farm south of here. And, your tendency is to try to they got this massive head and then this tiny little rear end, bison do. And you try to even it out in your drawing. And of course, it doesn't look like a bison if you do that.
Right.
Well, it was a similar kind of a thing with the kingfishers. You have to force yourself to make that head massive on a kingfisher. And then those feet are those dinky little undersized feet that they have.
Tyrannosaurus feet.
Right.
Yeah, they do.
That's one of the fun things about birds. There's such vast differences in morphology between the different species of birds.
Yes. Oh, yeah. It's great fun. Yeah.
It's fun to celebrate those things. Yeah.
Yeah. Barry, we talked earlier about inspiration. And I loved something you said about walking into a sanctuary in the morning with no expectations, but everything wide open, waiting for inspiration to visit you. Can you just speak to that a little bit?
Well, you do need to be in a certain sort of a headspace to do good field work. You really have to slow down. You have to really open your mind. You've got to really start noticing things. I think a lot of us, we go through our lives and we're so busy with what's going on in our heads. All of us do this, and we don't notice what's happening around us.
Right.
And I think just being able to put yourself in a space where you're really noticing, you're really looking, and then once you find something that you really would like to work with, to get yourself into that space where you can really, really focus, deeply focus, and get into a situation where you're really deeply observing what you're seeing. And then once you start the drawing process, that begins this sort of feedback loop where your drawing starts to tell you things about what you're seeing about the subject. So I've never had a problem getting into or finding things to draw, because I find that usually if you set yourself up to draw something, there's this energy that gets created between the subject and the drawing and yourself. That sort of feeds on itself and creates this, new questions. You see things or you understand things in a new way. You may see unexpected things that you never noticed before about something that you're drawing. So I think if you can get yourself into that space, that's the most important thing. It's not always easy. I remember going to a sanctuary in Westford. The first time I went there, the mosquitoes were horrible that day, and I didn't have any insect repellent. And that can be enough to really throw off your game.
Oh yes. Oh yes, it can.
And I just couldn't get into that space where I really could, really start to develop some good work. But usually I can do it. Usually I can get into the space I need to get into for that kind of investigation and that kind of observation. Yeah.
In a situation like that, were you ever tempted to just clip some botanical specimens, run to your car, and go back to the comfort of the studio?
Well, I did do that, as a matter of fact.
Yes.
In the book, you'll see several different botanical studies that were done where I collected specimens and brought them back to the studio. And that's a great way to work with botanicals. That's one of the nice things about working with plant materials, is that you can bring them back to the studio and work in a more controlled environment. Can't do that with birds, of course. Yeah.
No. But that said, your hepatica studies that were done
on location
are absolutely incredible, and you captured that evanescent cobalt violet of their flowers that is like no other flower color.
Absolutely.
And you set it off against those deep muddy browns of the early
The
spring
forest
frost.
floor, you bet.
Yes,
Yeah,
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 and
yeah, yeah.
I just love those. So I think this book is a visual delight. It's a treat for anyone who loves art, loves nature, and wants to paint themselves. I think this is such an inspirational book. And
Well, when they asked me to do the book, Julie, it did come up. Would I like to do some writing about the approaches of field work and the
of course,
materials? There's different sort of concepts that I might have developed with some of the paintings, and I jumped at the chance to do some of that with the book. I
yes,
realize it's primarily a book about nature and about nature painting, but I wanted to have some content in there for people who were aspiring to be artists or people who were just art appreciators, so they would get a better sense for what it's like to well, for example, going out and drawing from life. A lot of people, they find that there's some sort of magic involved there, that you can go out and draw a bird from life.
as an artist, Barry, my one of my very favorite parts of this book are the little artist tutorials that you do in the book. They're absolutely like developing, those snow buntings backlit, your work about writing about your field kit and how you
Hmm.
actually do what you do.
Hmm.
I think that this book is so many things. It gives you an overview of Mass Audubon sanctuaries and the amazing things that live there, but it also, actually feeds the artistic spark and gets people wanting to do this themselves.
Great,
So
great.
was that always part of your plan?
Well, it became part of the plan, certainly. I teach workshops, Julie, about of drawing and painting, and I do private instruction on drawing and painting. And a lot of my students, I know I knew that they would enjoy reading about these things. I also, at my shows and exhibitions, people always approach me and ask me technical questions or questions about watercolor technique and that type of thing. So I know there's that general interest in that out there. Even if you're not an artist yourself, there's a lot of interest in that. So I definitely decided that,
Yes.
if Amy was agreeable, I wanted to embellish the book with a lot of discussions about art, the techniques of art, the approaches of art, even some of the technical aspects of painting and field work and that type of thing. And I did write an introductory chapter, especially for the book, called Nature, Art, and Field and Studio, which goes into fairly good detail about drawing nature direct from life, a little bit about field painting. So I definitely wanted that content in there for people that I knew would appreciate it.
Well, it's deeply appreciated. It really brings the book to such life, because I think, the drumbeat that goes through this whole book is, how did he do this? How did he do this?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and it really gives you a good idea of what it's like to be out in the field, what it's like to paint in all weather conditions,
Hmm.
and try
Hmm.
to protect yourself from the elements and things like that.
Sure,
Yeah,
sure,
yeah.
sure.
So do you have a couple of a few favorite paintings in the book that you'd like to just hold up and
Well,
show
I don't have
us?
some paintings right here with me, but I do have all my sketchbooks that I kept during the course of the residency.
Yes.
I did about 200 finished watercolors for the, well, let me say
Mhm.
200 that I was willing to put in the book. People don't understand that not all paintings work out. And there were
Right.
a number that never got as far as the book, or that were abandoned for various reasons. Not every painting I do comes out the way I want it to. Uh, but
Sure.
I did get about 200 paintings done for the project, and I filled three 50-page sketchbooks with material as I was working on the project. The sketchbooks are a huge part
Well,
of my process, and they're essential for me in developing my ideas, and making lists of things that I see, keeping track, sort of an inventory of my experiences. So I'll just go through some of my sketchbook pages here, and I think you'll recognize, if people have seen the book, they'll recognize some of these things. This is a painting, a sketchbook page of hog peanut. It was done out at Cook's Canyon in Barrie, which is just west of here. This is the first time I'd really looked at this plant. It's a very delicate, airy plant that grows up and over other plants. It's one of the few sketchbook pages that I used right directly, as you see it here, as a full page spread in the book. A lot of the sketches you see in the book
nice.
I took as pieces from sketchbook pages, or I recombined sketches from various sources. So that one was one where I used it pretty much verbatim right from the book. A couple of other sketches here that I could just show you. Some things never made it as far as the book. Here's a sketchbook page of Brant geese done up up on the North Shore at Newburyport at Joppa Flats. And these Brant were out on the flats there and picking away at, I think, what was eelgrass, which is, I believe, one of their primary foods. But you'll see that what I'm doing here in my sketchbooks, I'm really searching for shapes, the essential shapes, looking for all the different shapes that birds make as they go about their lives. And I'm looking for very, very specific shapes, surprising shapes, and characteristic shapes.
Yeah. And doing it while the birds are moving constantly.
That's right.
And freezing those images in your brain.
Yeah.
And what was you said that with training, Lars Johnson thinks that people could extend their visual memory of a thing to 8 seconds.
Yeah, from 6 seconds to 8 seconds or something like that. Yeah. And that this is part of what people feel is sort of magic about what I do, is that I can look at a bird and I can draw it while it's moving around. I think basically what it takes is a lot of practice doing that. I was already well versed in drawing because I did a lot of figure drawing in college. So I was good at drawing, but when you start going out and looking at wild birds and trying to draw wild birds in the wild, there's a whole new skill set that you have to develop. So memory drawing is part of that. Rapidity of drawing, figuring out the drawing techniques that will allow you to make drawings quickly and efficiently because your time is so limited. So all of those things come into play when you're actually talking about drawing birds from life. A couple of other sketchbook pages. These are palm warblers. This was in the fall in Natick at the Broadmoor Wildlife Sanctuary, and become very involved in the different plumages that these palm warblers exhibited in fall when they were coming through in migration. And this is one of the things where the sketchbook really becomes a science lab, a vehicle for discovery and observation.
Yes, indeed it does.
Yes, you know about that. One of your favorite birds, Julie, I know. Piping plovers at Allen's Pond in North Dartmouth.
Yes.
These are done from life out on the open beach there. They had the nest roped off, of course, for the plovers. Great birds.
I don't know if you know, but my sister now lives right near Allen's Pond.
Is that right?
Yeah, she does.
What a
absolutely
wonderful.
Loves it.
There was 2 sanctuaries that were standouts for me during the project. People ask, what was your favorite sanctuary? And Allen's Pond was certainly, if not my favorite, one of my very favorite sanctuaries. Such a diversity of habitats and just great trails, all of that. Another one that I really loved was High Ledges in Shelburne, where I did the Yellow Lady Slippers. That was another one of my very favorite sanctuaries.
Oh, yes.
That limey, those limey soils that create all those wonderful wildflowers. So, yeah. What else can I show you here?
Yeah, fantastic.
There are a few here which do. This gives you a good example of a drawing, which I use pretty much just the way you see it in a in a studio painting in the book. This was a snowy owl at the Trailside Museum in Milton. I'm drawing an animal or a bird in an enclosure now. Okay, I'm outside a chain link fence. I'm using my telescope, and I'm looking at this bird perched on a stand in the cage. So there's a wonderful model. I mean, that model's not going anywhere, and I've got time to really develop a very careful drawing. And this became the basis for the watercolor you see in the book. Okay. Of course, a lot of these, I love wood warblers. I'm sure you do too. Here's some black-throated greens out at Poor Farm Hill in New Salem. Wood warblers are, I think, one of the most enticing groups of birds, and I never get tired of drawing and painting them.
Black-throated blues.
Yeah, black-throated blues.
I think you said greens.
Oh, did I? I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Sketchbook. So here's a few things from my sketchbook pages.
Fabulous. One bird that really sticks with me, Barry, is that grackle in the very beginning of the book, that grackle in the wind.
Grackle in the wind, yes, yes.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, it's great to show,
Beautiful.
get a sense of the environment that's happening as you're watching these birds. And when that grackle was hanging
Yes.
onto that stump, and its neck, its feathers in the chest were being all ruffled up, just gives you a different take on grackles. There it is, right there. You can see the wind was tossing up the feathers on the chest there, and hanging on in the wind. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you,
I
Julie.
love that. Is that taken straight from the sketchbook?
That was in a sketchbook page, yes. But I did the painting in the studio for that one. Grackles,
Okay.
black birds, as you probably know, can be
Yes.
really tricky to handle with the iridescence
Yes.
in their plumage and the color changes that happen as the light
Sure.
plays on their plumage. So
Yeah.
I did do that one in the studio. But the other thing that brings up is when I was doing this project, I was really focusing on very common birds, as well as of course, anything unusual that popped up, and that was good too. I'm not sure I would have forced myself to work with birds like blue jays and grackles and some of these very common birds if I hadn't done it in conjunction with the residency and gone to see these different. It's fun drawing very common birds. It's a real challenge because everybody knows these birds so well, including yourself, and you really know when you've got it wrong. It's like drawing your mother. When you haven't caught it, or your wife.
Right. True enough.
Yeah.
Well, Barry, thanks for this little romp through your studio. Thanks for telling us more about your artistic process. And most of all, thanks for giving the world an incredible body of work. Please do more.
Thank you, Julie. I look forward to doing much more of that. So, and I hope everyone enjoys what I put into this book, enjoys the writing as much as the pictures, because I enjoy, the whole thing was a labor of love for me. And I hope that shows in the result. Yeah. Okay.
It certainly shows. Yes. Thanks so much.
You bet. Take care now.
Hi, Barry. I'm sitting here in my studio on the island of Gotland, but I wish that I could be with you this very great day when your very own book is being published. It certainly brings back very fond memories in the 90s when I was spending some time in Massachusetts, going around to mass Audubon sanctuaries and drawing and painting not only birds but insects, flowers, landscapes, and so on. I haven't seen the full book yet, of course, but Amy sent me some spreads, and it certainly looks wonderful. I'm sure it will be a great success, and nobody can do this better than you. Your intimate knowledge of the subjects that you paint is outstanding, and we share the love for birds, and it's something that we have in common. Certainly, to be able to really spend time in the field, looking and drawing and painting, and want to get that very, very intimate feeling and knowledge of the subjects. In these very difficult times with the corona, I, of course, could not travel to the States, but I wish I could do it next year. I did plan to go to Massachusetts in September, but it has to be cancelled, of course. And I don't know what your plans are, but hopefully we could spend some time together in Massachusetts, going around and looking at birds during migration time. Then I have a question for you. What is your favorite place to go when it comes to painting birds? Whether it's warblers or waders or whatever. I have my own, which is Plum Island, which I always come back to if I have a chance. But my question is, what place would you go to in Massachusetts if you're out there trying to paint birds?
Hi, Barry. I've just been enjoying a copy of your new book, Finding Sanctuary, and just loving it. Congratulations. It's a fantastic body of work. The layout, the design, the writing is so engaging, and of course the artwork. It's just extraordinary. Your painting gets better and better. I think the thing that I've always admired most about your artwork is the drawing. And you talk about that in this book, that you emphasize that yourself. I'm just always amazed at how you capture the essence of something in just a few lines, and finding the perfect line and the right weight of line to just a few circles on the paper, and you have a handful of snails sort of roughly jumbled on the sheet of paper, or the clumsy gait of a turtle, or the elegance of a yellowlegs. And it's an amazing skill, and I know a hard-won ability that you have practiced and focused on. So it's wonderful to see, and really a pleasure to look at. And I have, I've spent my life studying birds, and I'm comfortable drawing birds. There are some birds that I'm more comfortable with than others. Some groups of species, like herons, that I have a little more trouble capturing in 2 dimensions. And you seem to move easily from snails to fiddlehead ferns to flowers to butterflies, birds, landscapes. And so I'm curious if there's anything that you struggle with or that you're a little less comfortable with. Was there anything, as you worked on this book, any subject that you said to yourself, oh no, today I have to go paint a blank?
Hi, my name is Sean Kent, and from the Museum of American Bird Art, and I'm really excited to introduce the artist of the hour, Barry Van Deusen. Here's Barry.
I wanted to thank Lars and David for contributing to this launch. They are both giants in the realm of bird art. Yes, Lars is a very large person, but that isn't what I mean. They're just very, very wonderful artists, and I've greatly admired their work and their careers over the years. I don't know if you heard Lars's question, but I did hear it in a previous section that I watched, and he asked about my favorite places to paint birds. What were my favorite places to paint birds? I know that Lars himself has some places there on Gotland, in the island in the Baltic where he lives, where he routinely goes and paints at a little cove, a rock-studded cove, and paints the ducks and the gulls and the waders that come there. Does these gorgeous watercolor paintings there. So I know what he's talking about. The coast is a wonderful place to draw and paint birds. The wide open spaces, you can work with a telescope, and you can work from a distance so the birds aren't disturbed. There's a lot of light and color at the shore. So I love working at the coast. He mentioned Plum Island in his interview. I don't know if you heard that segment, but I love Plum Island too, and I get up there as often as possible. I have some other coastal locations that I go to that are quite near where my wife's mother has a cottage down in Onset in Wareham. And there's some areas there which are within easy driving to Little Harbor in Wareham. I go there quite a bit, work with the shore birds and the birds of the coast there, and also Ellisville State Park, just up the coast in Plymouth, which is an easy drive from Onset too. And then inland, I live in central Massachusetts, so I'm really not that close to the coast. I'd love to be able to get to the coast more than I do. But there are some inland locations, wetlands, where I have similar opportunities, open environments where I can sit in one place and study the birds. One of them is right to the east of us in Sterling, Massachusetts. It's called, birders will know the name, it's called Sterling Peat. And that's a place where in late summer, especially when the water levels are low, the banks are exposed, and we get a lot of shorebirds moving through that area, in addition to herons and egrets, a lot of green herons. So that's a place I frequent to get those kinds of opportunities. Also, if I'm looking for smaller birds, passerines, songbirds, in spring migration, I frequent the trails and the gates out at the Quabbin Reservoir in central Massachusetts. The Quabbin's a huge, unspoiled area, a very remote feeling, and I love going out there in the spring and working with the smaller birds out there. There are waterfowl ponds in my own area where I watch in the fall when ducks are migrating in November, and I frequent those areas. So different times for different birds, but those are some of my favorite places. David Sibley asked what subjects I struggle with, and I can honestly say that when I first started drawing birds from life, which would have been nearly 40 years ago, believe it or not, when I first started doing that life work of drawing for birds, I have to say that all types of birds, all different types of birds, were a struggle. And I really had to work to learn the structure and the anatomy and the differences between the different types of birds. And then lots and lots of hours in the field looking at those different types of birds. And with all those years of doing that, the drawings start to become easier, and the drawings look a little more effortless. So, but there are subjects that I do struggle with, certainly. Not so much birds, but mammals. I have a difficult time with many mammals. In 1997, I traveled to India with a group of artists sponsored by the Artists for Nature Foundation, and we went to a tiger park in central India, and we saw wild tigers in the wild from the backs of elephants. It was just an amazing experience. But I had a terrible time drawing the tigers. It was so difficult. And I realized my problem was that I really hadn't drawn many cats, many felines. And some of the artists, very wisely, what they had done before they in the weeks before the project, they had done lots of observing and drawing of their pet cats or their neighbors' pet cats, and that was a really wise thing to do. So they were equipped with dealing with that a little bit more. So it really depends on what you've got experience with, and building up over time the skills to work with the various different types of plants and animals. Does Sean have a question for me at this point?
Yes, Barry. The third question comes from Nita Doggett. What was the most rewarding sanctuary visit, and what was your most surprising and unexpected visit?
Well, those are great questions from Nina. Thank you, Nina. I would say probably some of my most rewarding sanctuary experiences were when I teamed up with some of the Mass Audubon naturalists and figured out how to be in the right place at the right time for some very special wildflowers, some rare wildflowers that bloom in some of the sanctuaries in western Massachusetts. Ron Willanen, who's a staff naturalist, he circulates among these western sanctuaries on a weekly basis, and he would call me up if something special was blooming, and he would tell me exactly where to go. I would sometimes jot things down and make myself a little treasure map, and then I'd get right out there. Sometimes he'd tell me, you better get out there. These things won't last very long. So I'd hop in my car the next morning and drive out and follow his directions exactly. He was wonderful about. He'd flag these little shrubs, so I'd know where to turn off the trail and things like that. I'm talking about things like the yellow lady slippers at High Ledges and the smaller purple fringed orchids at West Mountain in Plainfield. Really a special experience to see these plants in full bloom and to be able to spend some concentrated time drawing and painting them. Nina also wondered about my most surprising experience at a sanctuary, and I think probably one of the things I least expected. I was at Wellfleet Bay out on Cape Cod, I knew that the sanctuary, the Wellfleet folks at Sanctuary were monitoring diamondback terrapin nests, and I'm going out on the trails and walking around. I could see these where they had put enclosures over the where the terrapins had dug their nests. So I knew they were involved in this, but I ran into a group of the nest monitors there out on Tri Island that day, and they let me look right over their shoulder as they were assisting at the hatching of a nest. So they're helping these little baby birds emerge from the eggs, and then they were putting them into these Tupperware containers. They were using a little spray bottle, you know, to keep them moist. And then they move them to an area where they're going to be out of harm's way from the laughing gulls overhead or the skunks or the foxes. And it was really special to see these gorgeous little turtles freshly emerged from their eggs, just beautiful little creatures. That was quite unexpected. Another experience that I didn't expect was up at Ipswich River in Topsfield. Walking the trails that day, I would settle down to paint and draw, and small birds, titmice, chickadees, nuthatches, they would approach me quite closely that day. Wherever I sat down, they'd come right up to me. They'd sit on the branches around, sometimes only at arm's length away, and they would call at me. And I thought, well, this is kind of odd, you know. And when I got back to the parking lot there at Ipswich River, I met Sandy Selesky. She's a photographer who works up in that area. And I mentioned this to her, and she said, oh, yes, of course. You know, well, you know, people routinely, this sanctuary is known for a place where routinely people carry bird seed in their pockets, and they feed the birds when they're out walking the trails, and that explained it. So that was certainly an unexpected treat at one of the sanctuaries.
Hi,
Thanks,
Barry.
Nina.
Yep, this question comes from Lillian Armstrong. She says she's interested in beginnings. Do you recall the first painting in our project that you gave you confidence to pursue a career based on your amazing talent? What you just said about birds being able to paint while observing in the field does indeed sound like magic.
Certainly, you know, those early years of drawing birds, I have to say, were very discouraging for me. I was inspired by some people that were doing this type of thing. One key player there was Eric Enyon, a British artist. And he was one of the first pioneers to really do a lot of drawing of birds from life. So I could see that it could be done. I was very excited by his drawings. But when I tried it myself, I thought, oh, he must have some sort of, you know, magic, you know, memory that he can do this, because I was so discouraged. In fact, the first 3 years that I drew, the first 3 years of sketches, I got so discouraged that I burned them in the fireplace that winter. And I wish I hadn't done that, actually, because I would have loved to show students these days how awkward they were when I first started out. But, you know, you look for these little successes, you know, every now and then I'd get a sketch that would come together just right. And that would be enough encouragement for me to keep on. And then there's a point where after you get past the struggle, it starts to be fun, and it starts to be a habit, and a habit that I couldn't go by a week without picking up my sketchbook and getting outdoors and drawing and painting. So it takes those little bits of encouragement from your own work to keep you moving on it. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Barry. Our next question comes from Gary Clayton, our former president. He sends his congratulations on the book.
Very good.
And he said, as you know, we'll be providing a copy of your book to nearly 500 public libraries throughout Massachusetts. Hopefully this will inspire future Barry Van Dusens. What advice would you give these young naturalists and aspiring artists? And that's from Gary Clayton.
Absolutely wonderful, Gary. That's a great question too. I think probably the one advice I would give to anyone who wants to get into this line of work is to start using a sketchbook regularly. Get outdoors with a sketchbook regularly. And it can start small. You know, you really should don't try. Well, what I did, of course, was I tried to run into the woods and start drawing and painting these wild birds right away. But I realized that's kind of like, you know, playing Beethoven on piano before you've learned the scales. So you have to start slow. I encourage people to you know, do things like work at zoos and nature centers, and even work with things like plants. You know, things that don't move or fly away. Any kind of natural objects, dead birds that hit the window. You want to work with those. Seashells and seashore creatures, and just build your observation skills. builds your power of observation, your powers to notice things, and to record them in any way that you can with the skills that you have. And it'll build from there. If you practice, it'll come. Thank you, Gary. That was a great question.
All right, wonderful. And then I've got a few questions from Michael Boardman and also Joy asking, do you use any reference photographs with your sketches when you're doing your finished paintings? And were there times when your subject flew away before you had enough of the drawing down?
That happened an awful lot, actually. The birds, that's one of the very tricky things about birds, of course, is you're always on borrowed time. Wherever I went, and part of my field kit is a small digital camera, a little pocket digital camera that I carry with me, and I've rigged that up so that I can use it through a telescope. So I use that wherever I went on these sanctuary visits. I also did at the same time all kinds of direct drawing and painting, and the digital camera was very good for recording things like background material. I'd get so involved in drawing the birds that I wouldn't record enough information about maybe the vegetation or the leaves or the twigs that they were sitting on. So the digital camera was very good for that purpose. But also the photographs, the digital camera also allowed me to work with situations and subjects that would be very difficult or impossible otherwise. One good example of that is very small objects, very tiny objects. One of the very last illustrations in the book is a spring azure done up at the Wildwood camp. And these are very tiny, tiny little butterflies, you know, like 5/8 of an inch is the total length of the wing. And my eyes aren't getting any younger. And to work with a tiny creature like that, digital cameras are an excellent tool for that. In fact, I've gone to some of these moth nights where you hang a big sheet up and you look at the moths that are coming flying in and landing on the sheet. And all of the moth enthusiasts, they have a little digital camera with them and they take pictures of the moth and then they blow it up on their little screen on their camera to get the details. So that was one example where a camera really comes in handy. And another is, of course, and I've already talked about the diamondback terrapins, but that was a situation where the turtles could not be exposed to a great deal of light and sunlight. I couldn't ask these monitors these nest monitors to allow me to draw the turtles out in the hot sun there. So the digital camera allowed me to work with those subjects. So I think. I think the camera is a very valuable tool, and I think if you're not using a camera for some of these wonderful purposes, you're missing out on some wonderful artistic opportunities.
Okay, thanks so much, Barry. We have time for 2 more questions, so I'm going to ask 2 more.
Okay.
One comes from the audience, but I'm not sure the person's name, and it's technical. They ask how do you paint a subject with a toned background, like the snowy owl behind you? Do you use sorry, that something that was unclear. Do you paint the background first? Do you paint the snowy owl first and carefully add the background? Like, what's your thought process and planning and all that goes into that type of painting?
I do write about that in the book. Some of the paintings in the book I don't put any background in whatsoever. I just they're on a white background. But I also like to get a sense of environment in there. And what you're talking about is I think what he's asking about is the background washes. That how do I establish those? Do I establish those before I work on the subject itself or the bird itself? I would say that I always try to keep all parts of a painting coming along together. So one of the things I do first is I often paint and I talk about this in the book, I will paint the shadow pattern of the subject and the shadows in the background. And that gets me into starting to develop both the background and the subject together. And I think it's very important that you do that. Otherwise, sometimes often students will put so much effort into their bird, and then the background, well, that's not so important, and they dash in some color around it, and of course the painting suffers for that. The background is just as important as the subject. But bringing those two along, simultaneously in the painting process is very important for me. So have them look at the book and some of the tutorials where I talked about backgrounds and painting shadow patterns.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And our last question it comes from Donna, and I think it really ties in nicely to how you talk about slowing down and really taking the time to observe when you're in the sanctuary. So she was asking, on your sketch pages, there's some text and some notes. What type of comments and what are you writing in your field notes? Like, and how does that add to sketching and then also your studio paintings?
That's a great question. You know, I sometimes have to I'm more of a visual person than a verbal person, and I sometimes have to force myself to remember to, you know, take notes in my sketchbooks in addition to doing the drawings. However, on the sanctuary visits, one thing I used those the note taking for was I kept very careful track on my sketchbook pages of all the different plants and animals that I was encountering at the different sanctuaries. So looking at those 3 sketchbooks with those hundreds of drawings and subjects in them, you can actually track the an inventory of all the different things I was seeing at the various sanctuaries. But I record other things in written ways too. I often record field conditions, you know, things like temperature and weather. You know, field challenges like you know, insects or poisonous plants, that type of thing. That can bring back the day very vividly to me. Behavior is something I will write about too. If you see a sequence of behavior in a bird, sometimes that's easier to write down than it is to try to draw that. So I'll take careful notes if I see a certain type of a sequence of behavior going on, and those can be very useful later in the studio to bring the whole experience back to me. But you know, some people fill their sketchbook pages with mostly writing and not as much drawing. But I try to remind myself that I do need to do the writing as well as the drawing. So, well, I hope everyone's enjoyed this launch, and I certainly have. And I hope you all enjoy the book, both the writing and the pictures. And I hope to see some of you in the field or at the museum soon. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Barry. And to conclude our program, I'm going to introduce now Amy Montague, the Museum Director of the Museum of American Bird Art. Thank you so much, Barry. And here's Amy.
Thank you, Sean.
Well, I'm sorry that brings our event to a close, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Barry, for sharing your deep knowledge and your love of nature, your extraordinary artistry through this book. And thank you to all in the audience, and good night.